Before we begin, tell us in the comments which city you're watching from, and at the end, don't forget to rate this story from 0 to 10. Enjoy the story. The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Sterling Tower like an angry accusation. Victoria Rivera stood in the 42nd floor corridor, adjusting her glasses and checking her phone for the third time. 8:45 in the morning, and she was already questioning every life decision that had brought her here. Her reflection stared back from the polished elevator doors. Dark hair pulled into a severe bun, navy blazer immaculate, expression professionally neutral. Armor. That's what she'd called it in graduate school, the outfit that said, "I am in control. Your chaos will not touch me." She'd need it today. The email from Marcus Sterling's executive assistant had been characteristically terse. "Mr. Sterling will see you at 9 a.m. sharp. Do not be late. Do not be naive. Do not waste his time." Victoria had almost laughed. Almost. 23 years as a therapist, specializing in anger management, conflict resolution, and the emotional rehabilitation of people who'd forgotten how to be human. And she'd never encountered a client quite like Marcus Sterling. The billionaire real estate developer was infamous, not for his business acumen, though he possessed that in spades. Not for his philanthropic ventures, though he donated generously to elite institutions. No, Marcus Sterling was famous for his rages. There was the incident where he'd allegedly thrown a phone through a conference room window, the day he'd reduced a junior architect to tears in front of 30 people. The legendary explosion at a Manhattan gala, where he'd called a prominent socialite's charity work performative drivel, and walked out, leaving his date stranded. The man was a walking lawsuit, waiting to happen, which is exactly why his lawyers had hired her. Victoria pushed through the heavy glass doors, marked Sterling Development Corporation at 8:58. The reception area was all chrome and marble, cold, expensive, deliberately intimidating. A young woman with frightened eyes looked up from her desk. "Dr. Rivera? That's me. Mr. Sterling he's in his office. Conference room 3, actually. He prefers to conduct these meetings there." The receptionist hesitated, then lowered her voice. "He's been in a mood all morning." Victoria smiled thinly. "Aren't they always?" The conference room was on the opposite end of the floor, a deliberate power play Victoria recognized. Make the therapist walk, establish dominance before the conversation even began. She'd seen it 100 times. Billionaires were often just children in expensive suits, testing boundaries to see who'd give them attention first. She knocked. "Come in." His voice was exactly as she'd imagined, deep, clipped, carrying the weight of someone accustomed to immediate obedience. Victoria straightened her spine, took a breath that centered her nervous system, and entered. Marcus Sterling sat at the head of a table the size of a small apartment, reviewing documents with the intensity of a man examining evidence at a crime scene. He didn't look up as she crossed the threshold. His dark hair was disheveled, the kind of disheveled that cost $200 a haircut to achieve, and his Brioni suit was probably worth more than her monthly mortgage. But it was his hands that caught her attention. They were clenched, not metaphorically, literally balled into fists on either side of the documents, knuckles white with tension. Even at rest, he was aggressive. "Ms. Rivera," he said, still not looking up. "Sit." "Dr. Rivera," she corrected, pulling out a chair 3 seats away from him. "The doctorate is in clinical psychology. I earned it at Columbia." Now he looked up. His eyes were steel gray, the color of a winter sky. They flickered, just for a moment, with something that might have been surprise or might have been annoyance. With men like this, the two were often indistinguishable. "I don't care if you earned it from a fortune cookie," he said flatly. "My lawyers insist I need therapy. You're here. Can we skip the credentials?" "We can," Victoria said, opening her leather portfolio and retrieving her notepad. "But it would help if you understood that I'm not here to be impressed by you or intimidated by you. I'm here to help you develop functional communication strategies and emotional regulation techniques. Everything else is ego, and ego is just fear wearing an expensive suit." She watched his jaw clench. "That was a lot of assumptions in one sentence," he said coldly. "Is any of it wrong?" Marcus set down his pen with deliberate precision, the kind of precision people used when they wanted to communicate rage without raising their voice. "You know what I think, Dr. Rivera? I think my lawyers wasted money hiring you because you're going to sit there, analyze me like I'm some broken toy, and tell me things I already know. I'm aware I have an anger problem. I'm aware it's cost me relationships and professional opportunities. I'm aware that I'm probably the most difficult person you've ever met. Shall I continue, or can we move on to whatever condescending advice you're preparing?" Victoria made a note, which only seemed to infuriate him further. "Stop writing. I'm not your case study." "You are, actually. That's exactly what you are." She looked up from her pad, met his gaze directly. "You're a man who's built an empire by being the smartest person in the room. You've learned that intimidation works better than negotiation. You've learned that anger is a tool. What you haven't learned is when to put it down. And you think you can teach me that?" "I think you're scared," Victoria said quietly. "And I think anger is easier than fear." The silence that followed was absolute. Outside, the rain continued its assault on the windows. Inside, the conference room held its breath. Marcus's hands unclenched slowly. "You have no idea what you're talking about," he said, but his voice had lost its edge. "Maybe not," Victoria agreed. "But I know that a man doesn't hire a therapist he doesn't think he needs. Your lawyers hired me, but you could have refused. You could have waited out this contract. Instead, you showed up. You're here. That tells me something." "What does it tell you?" "That some part of you wants to be different." Marcus turned away, staring out at the rain-darkened Manhattan skyline. From this height, the city looked almost vulnerable. All those tiny people trying to matter, trying to connect, trying to survive. He was quiet for so long that Victoria wondered if he'd dismissed her, if she'd pushed too hard too soon. Finally, he spoke. "My father used to say that vulnerability was the tool of the weak, that the only way to survive in this world was to be harder than everyone else, to never show a crack." "And how's that working out for you?" Victoria asked gently. He laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. "I'm sitting in a conference room with a therapist I don't want, trying to explain myself to a woman I just met, all because I threw a coffee cup at my conference table last week. So I'd say it's working about as well as your strategy of pushing me to emotional honesty within 5 minutes of introduction." Despite herself, Victoria smiled. "Fair point." Something shifted in his expression, not softening exactly, but changing. Like a lock recognizing a key it hadn't expected. "Are you going to psychoanalyze that smile?" he asked. "Do you want me to?" "No." "Then I won't." He turned back to face her fully. This close, she could see the exhaustion etched into the lines around his eyes. This close, she could see that beneath the rage was something else, something lonelier and more fractured than any billionaire had a right to be. "Why did you take this job?" he asked. "You're clearly too intelligent to be working for my lawyers. You could be doing something more meaningful." Victoria considered the question. "Because I believe that people can change, even difficult ones, especially difficult ones. And if I can't, then we'll both be wasting our time, and I'll charge you handsomely for it." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, actually tugged at it. Victoria noted this with professional satisfaction and personal alarm. She was not supposed to find Marcus Sterling attractive. He was a client, and she was being paid specifically because he was impossible. "I have weekly Tuesday meetings," he said. 9 a.m. here, 1 hour. You don't speak to my staff about our sessions. You don't discuss me with anyone. You don't use anything I tell you against me. Those are reasonable parameters," Victoria said, making notes. "I'd add that you approach these sessions with intention. If you're just going to sit and perform resistance, we both know how this ends." And how does it end? With you exactly where you are now, angry, alone, powerful, but fundamentally disconnected from your own life. Another long pause, another moment where she thought she'd gone too far. Tuesday, he said finally, 9 a.m. Don't be late. I'm never late, Victoria said, standing. It's a matter of professional respect. Is it? Marcus asked. Or is it just another form of control? She paused at the door, glancing back. His expression was unreadable, but his grey eyes held something. Curiosity, maybe. Or challenge. Same time next week, she said, and left him there, surrounded by expensive furniture and expensive suits and all the money in the world, looking fundamentally like a man who didn't know how to be happy. As the elevator descended, Victoria adjusted her glasses and made a mental note: do not get involved with the client. Maintain professional boundaries. Do not mistake emotional breakthrough for romantic connection. She was excellent at maintaining boundaries. She was fairly certain, almost certain, that it wouldn't be a problem. 7 days later, Victoria arrived at Stirling Tower at 8:52 a.m. She'd deliberately chosen 8:52 instead of 9 because she'd realized something during her commute. Punctuality wasn't just respect. It was a power move, and if Marcus Stirling was going to hire a therapist, he needed someone who didn't play by his rules. She carried her usual portfolio, a fresh notebook, and 2 coffees from the Italian place on the corner. One was black, no sugar. She'd learned his order from his assistant without asking him directly. The other was oat milk latte for herself. The receptionist looked up with what might have been relief. He's already in conference room 3. He's been there since 7:30. Of course he had. Marcus was dressed in an immaculate charcoal suit, but something about him looked different. Thinner, maybe, or perhaps just more compressed, like a man holding his breath. He didn't look up as she entered, but his hands were relaxed on the table. Progress, Victoria thought. I brought coffee, she said, setting his on the table in front of him. Black, no sugar. He looked at it, then at her. You remembered. I listen. It's literally my job. Something flickered across his face, something that might have been gratitude, quickly suppressed. He picked up the cup and took a long sip, and Victoria sat down, settling into the rhythm of their session. How was your week? She asked. Fine. That's not an answer, that's a deflection. Marcus set down his coffee with careful precision. I had a board meeting on Friday. The Riverside project is behind schedule, $2 million over budget. I didn't yell at anyone. I didn't throw anything. I sat in a room full of incompetent architects and listened to excuses for 45 minutes without raising my voice. How did that feel? Like I was going to explode. But you didn't. I went to the gym instead, hit the bag for 3 hours. Victoria made a note. That's healthy channeling. You took the emotional energy and converted it into physical activity instead of projecting it onto your staff. That's progress. It doesn't feel like progress. It feels like I'm just containing it. Containing it is the first step, Victoria said. Eventually we work toward processing it, understanding it, but containment is where we start. Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying her with those intelligent grey eyes. You talk about anger like it's a disease, like it's something to be cured, isn't it? No. He stood and walked to the window, and Victoria had the sudden impression of a caged animal. Anger isn't the problem, Dr. Rivera. It's the solution. It's the only thing that's ever worked for me. When I was angry, I survived. When I was angry, I built an empire. When I was angry, nobody could touch me. Victoria set down her pen. Tell me about surviving. He didn't turn around. Outside, Manhattan glittered in the morning light, indifferent, relentless, alive. My father was a developer, Marcus said quietly. Not like me. He was comfortable, middle-class comfortable. Content with his little projects, his modest office, his modest life. My mother left when I was 8. She said he was boring. She said she needed excitement, passion, someone who would fight for her. He paused, and Victoria waited. This was the moment. This was where the fortress cracked. He never fought for her. He just let her go. And then he let the business die. He let everything die. He became this ghost of a man who drank too much and talked about how he'd had dreams once. "And you swore you'd be different," Victoria said. "I swore I'd never be weak like that. I swore I'd never let anything or anyone matter enough to destroy me." He finally turned back to face her. "So I built walls. I built them high and thick and made them impenetrable. And it worked. I became untouchable." "At what cost?" Victoria asked. "What do you mean? You're 42 years old. You've built a business empire worth billions, and you're sitting in a conference room with a therapist because you threw a coffee cup. That's not untouchable, Marcus. That's exhausted. That's a man whose walls are cracking from the inside." He stared at her for a long moment. His jaw worked. His hands clenched again. "Don't," he said finally. "Don't what?" "Don't try to fix me by making me feel guilty about my success." "I'm not," Victoria said. "I'm suggesting that success without connection is just accumulation. You're accumulating things, money, power, possessions, but you're not building anything that matters, nothing that would survive you. That's not fair." "No," Victoria agreed. "It's not, but it's true." Marcus turned back to the window. When he spoke again, his voice was barely audible. "There was a woman, 3 years ago. She wanted to marry me. She was good, smart, kind. She didn't care about the money. She cared about me." Victoria's pen hovered over her notepad. She had the sudden, violent urge not to write this down, not to document it, not to turn his vulnerability into data. She set down her pen. "What happened?" she asked. "I was afraid. Of her. Of myself, of the fact that she had the power to destroy me if she wanted to. So I destroyed it first. I said something cruel at a party, on purpose. She left and I told myself I'd done the right thing, kept myself safe." "Do you feel safe?" Victoria asked. Marcus laughed, that same bitter sound from the first session. "I feel like I'm dying a slow death in a penthouse office." The words hung between them like a confession in a confessional. "Thank you for telling me that," Victoria said softly. "That took courage. Don't thank me, it's weakness. It's honesty, there's a difference." Marcus returned to the table and sat across from her, and for the first time since she'd met him, he wasn't performing. The armor was there, but there were cracks now. Light was getting through. "She's getting married," he said. "I got the invitation last month. I didn't go, but I thought about it constantly. I wondered what she'd wear, who she'd marry, if she'd be happy." "Do you love her?" "I don't know if I'm capable of love. I thought I was, but then when the moment came, I couldn't do it." Victoria leaned forward. "That's not incapacity. That's fear. And fear is something we can work with." "Can we?" Marcus asked. "Can you really fix 3 decades of emotional dysfunction in weekly therapy sessions?" "Probably not completely," Victoria said with a small smile. "But we can make you functional enough to have a real conversation with someone without wanting to punch a wall." This time, when he smiled, it reached his eyes. It was small and fragile and absolutely devastating. "I think," he said, "that might be a start." The session ended at 10 a.m., exactly as scheduled. But as Victoria gathered her things, Marcus spoke again. "Next Tuesday," he said. "Same time." "Same time," she confirmed. "Dr. Rivera," he called as she reached the door. "Thank you for not treating me like I'm broken, for treating me like I'm just stuck." Victoria paused, her hand on the doorframe. She turned back and found him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite name, something between longing and resignation. "You're not stuck," she said carefully. "You're just afraid of what happens when you move." She left him there, sitting in his conference room, surrounded by glass and steel and all the armor money could buy, and she tried very hard not to think about the way his eyes had held hers when he smiled, or the possibility that she might be making a catastrophic professional error. On the elevator down, Victoria called her supervisor, a clinical psychologist she'd worked with for 15 years. "I need to consult on a case," she said. "I might have a conflict of interest." "What kind of conflict?" Dr. Patel asked. Victoria watched the floor numbers descend. The kind where I'm starting to care too much about my client's outcome. The kind where I'm rooting for him instead of treating him. There was a pause. Do you need to transfer the case? Victoria thought about Marcus's vulnerability, his honesty, the way he'd let her see behind the walls. She thought about the woman he'd let go, and the fear that had driven him to cruelty. No, she said finally, I think I need to do my job better. But even as she said it, she knew she was lying. She was already too involved. She was already too invested. And when you were a therapist who believed in emotional honesty, lying to yourself was the most dangerous disease of all. 2 weeks into their sessions, Victoria had developed a dangerous routine. She arrived at Sterling Tower every Tuesday at 8:52 a.m. She brought coffee, black, no sugar. She sat across from Marcus Sterling in conference room 3 and pretended that her heart rate didn't accelerate when he looked at her. Pretended that she wasn't analyzing his expressions for signs of vulnerability. Pretended that she was maintaining professional boundaries when in fact she'd obliterated them entirely. The sessions had evolved. Marcus was opening up, cautiously at first, then with increasing honesty. He'd talked about his father's alcoholism, his mother's abandonment, the way he'd built his empire as a monument to his own survival. He'd talked about insomnia, about panic attacks he disguised as irritability, about the terror of being truly known by another person. Victoria had listened, documented, and analyzed. She'd also fallen asleep twice, thinking about the way he looked when he was vulnerable, the softness in his grey eyes, the way his jaw unclenched when he felt safe. She was a disaster. This was the thought occupying her mind when she arrived at the office on a Tuesday in late November, only to find the receptionist looking panicked. Dr. Rivera, thank God. Mr. Sterling's in his office. There's been an incident. Victoria's stomach dropped. What kind of incident? He was in a meeting with the board of directors from the Riverside project. There was a disagreement about construction timelines. The receptionist swallowed hard. He threw a laptop. Is anyone hurt? No, but it's bad. Really bad. His assistant is fielding calls from lawyers. I think someone's threatening to sue. Victoria didn't hesitate. She moved directly to Marcus's office, bypassing the assistant who tried to stop her. Marcus stood behind his desk, staring out at the Manhattan skyline. He was still in his meeting clothes, expensive suit, silk tie, but his jacket was unbuttoned and his tie was loose. His hair was disheveled in a way that had nothing to do with expensive haircuts. "Get out," he said without turning around. "No." He spun to face her, and Victoria saw the rage first, pure, undiluted fury burning behind his eyes. But beneath it, she saw the panic, the shame. I said, "Get out, Victoria." It was the first time he'd used her first name. She filed that away for later analysis and locked the door behind her. "What happened?" she asked calmly. "I lost control." "Tell me." Marcus paced like a caged predator. "There was a structural issue with the Riverside project. Nothing catastrophic, but it means 6 weeks of delay. The board wanted to hide it from the investors. Present a different timeline and hope nobody noticed the discrepancy. I said no. They said it was business as usual. I said it was fraud. They called me naive, idealistic, stupid." He stopped pacing, his hands clenching into fists. "And I threw a laptop at the wall. Did you throw it at a person?" "No, but..." "Did you hurt anyone?" "No, but..." "Marcus, did anyone require medical attention?" "No, God damn it, but I still broke my own rule. I still lost control." Victoria sat down in one of the leather chairs across from his desk. She kept her voice steady, professional, even as her mind raced with the implications. "Tell me what happened right before you threw it." "What do you mean, what happened? I just told you..." "No," Victoria interrupted. "Tell me the exact moment. What were you feeling? What did you think? What was the trigger?" Marcus stopped pacing. He sat behind his desk, suddenly looking exhausted. "They said I was naive, idealistic. They said that's why I'd never really be part of their world, that I'd always be on the outside looking in." Victoria felt her chest tighten. "And that reminded you of..." "My father," Marcus finished. of him being pushed out of his own company, of watching him become irrelevant. You're not your father, aren't I? Marcus looked at her with raw pain in his eyes. I'm building an empire just like he didn't. And the moment I show weakness, the moment I try to do something right instead of profitable, I'm marked as an outsider, exactly like him. Victoria stood and walked around his desk. It was a violation of every professional boundary she'd ever established. It was irresponsible, unethical, and absolutely necessary. You made a choice, she said quietly. You chose integrity over profit. That's not weakness, Marcus. That's the opposite of your father. He chose safety, you chose principle. And I broke a laptop. Yes, you did. And now you need to decide what happens next. Marcus looked up at her, and the desperation in his expression almost undid her. I don't know what happens next. I don't know how to fix this. You apologize, Victoria said. You tell the board that their suggestion was unethical, and you won't participate in fraud. You tell the investors about the delay yourself. And you accept that doing the right thing sometimes means losing the approval of people who don't deserve it. That could destroy the company. It could, Victoria agreed. Or it could be the beginning of something actually built on something other than fear. Marcus stood, and suddenly they were very close. Close enough that Victoria could see the exhaustion etched into the lines of his face. Close enough to see the flecks of silver in his grey eyes. You believe in me, he said. It wasn't a question. I do, Victoria said, and then immediately regretted it, because that was crossing a line. That was moving from professional support into personal investment. You shouldn't, Marcus said. I'm a mess. I throw things. I hurt people. You're a person learning to regulate your emotions, Victoria corrected. You're a person who's been terrified of connection his whole life and is just now trying to be brave enough to have it. Yes, you broke a laptop. Yes, you made a mistake. But you're also here talking to me about it instead of hiding in a bottle like your father did. Victoria, and you're going to call the board. You're going to tell them the truth, and you're going to rebuild your company on integrity instead of ego. Marcus reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, a gesture so tender it made her breath catch. You're dangerous, you know that? How so? You make me believe I could be someone other than what I've always been. You already are, Victoria whispered. That's what you don't see. They stood there, suspended in a moment that had nothing to do with therapy and everything to do with two people who'd recognized something broken and beautiful in each other. Victoria knew she should step back. She knew she should reinstall the professional boundaries. She knew she should probably transfer his case to another therapist immediately. Instead, she did nothing. It was Marcus who stepped back first, running a hand through his disheveled hair. I need to fix this. The board, the investors, everything. Yes, you do, Victoria said, retreating to her professional mask, even as her hands trembled slightly. And I'll be here when you come back. A promise? The question hung between them, simple but loaded with meaning that transcended their therapeutic relationship. I promise, Victoria said, and knew in that moment that she'd fundamentally compromised her ethics. She'd stopped being his therapist somewhere around week 3. She'd become something else entirely, something dangerous and wonderful and absolutely unethical. The next 6 hours were chaotic. Marcus called an emergency board meeting. He revealed the structural issues with the Riverside project. He told the board exactly what he thought about their suggestion to commit fraud. 3 board members resigned. 2 threatened legal action. Victoria watched from a coffee shop nearby, refreshing her email obsessively, checking news sites, waiting for the fallout she was certain would come. At 9 p.m., her phone rang. It's done, Marcus said. His voice was hoarse. What happened? I told the investors everything. I offered to absorb 60% of the additional costs to cover the delay. They accepted, but they're restructuring the board. I'm stepping down as CEO, moving to creative director position instead. Victoria's heart sank. Marcus, I'm so sorry. I shouldn't have pushed you to— Victoria. His voice was quiet, but firm. Stop. You didn't push me into anything. You just showed me what was possible if I stopped being afraid. What are you going to do? Take the next 2 weeks off, something I haven't done in 5 years, then rebuild this company the way I should have from the beginning. He paused. And I was hoping you might get dinner with me. Victoria closed her eyes. I can't. Because of professional ethics? Because of professional ethics, she confirmed. Because I've already compromised too much of my integrity. Because I need to transfer your case to another therapist, and I need to do that before this gets any more complicated. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for an eternity. What if I don't want another therapist? Marcus asked finally. Then what you want and what you need are at odds. Are they? His voice held a challenge. Or are they the exact same thing for the first time in my life? Victoria opened her mouth to respond, to give him the logical, ethical answer. Instead, she heard herself say, "Call me on Wednesday. Not as a client, not as a therapist, just as two people who need to figure out what this is." Wednesday, Marcus repeated, like he was cementing it into existence. Wednesday, Victoria confirmed, and then disconnected before she could change her mind or analyze the implications of what she'd just done. She walked home through Manhattan in the cold November night, her therapist's notebook heavy in her bag, like evidence of crimes she was about to commit. She'd violated every principle she'd taught, every boundary she'd established, every ethical guideline in her field. She was also, Victoria realized with something approaching terror, profoundly in love. And somewhere in a penthouse office above the glittering city, Marcus Sterling was probably feeling exactly the same way. Wednesday came with grey skies and Victoria's complete psychological unraveling. She'd spent the past 48 hours doing what therapists are explicitly trained never to do, overanalyzing her own emotions, justifying her ethical violations, and constructing elaborate mental frameworks to convince herself that what she was about to do was somehow defensible. It wasn't. She knew this. Every clinical supervision course, every ethics seminar, every conversation with her colleagues over the past 2 decades had reinforced this fundamental truth. You do not become romantically involved with clients. The power dynamic is inherently compromised. The professional relationship is irreversibly damaged. The potential for harm to the client, to yourself, to your reputation and career is catastrophic. Victoria had delivered these lectures herself. She'd written about it. She'd judged other therapists who'd crossed this line, and now she was one of them. At 6:45 p.m., she stood in front of her bathroom mirror in her apartment in Brooklyn, changing clothes for the 3rd time. Black dress was too formal. Jeans were too casual. She finally settled on dark slacks and a cream silk blouse, professional enough to feel like armor, casual enough to feel like authenticity. The restaurant Marcus had chosen was in Tribeca, a small Italian place that clearly catered to people who preferred invisibility over spectacle. No paparazzi, no Wall Street crowds, no witnesses. She arrived at 7:15, deliberately early, needing the time to manage her nervous system before he arrived. The hostess seated her at a corner table. Marcus had already arranged it, Victoria assumed. The man didn't leave details to chance. He appeared at 7:23, and Victoria's carefully managed equilibrium immediately destabilized. He was still in his work clothes, charcoal suit, white shirt, but his tie was gone and his top button was undone. He looked both exactly as he did in their sessions and completely different. The professional armor was gone, replaced by something more vulnerable. He looked like a person rather than a role. "Hi," he said simply, sitting across from her. "Hi," Victoria echoed. They stared at each other for a long moment, not in an awkward way, but in the way of two people who'd been speaking a professional language so carefully that actual words felt inadequate now. "I transferred your case," Victoria said without preamble, "to Dr. Samuel Chen. He specializes in anger management and has excellent outcomes. I sent him all your files and notes." "I know," Marcus said. Your supervisor called me, asked if I was comfortable with the transition. What did you say? I said yes because I respect her protocols, and I respect you enough not to put you in a position where you lose your license. He leaned forward slightly. But I also said that the reason for the transfer was that I was no longer her client in any meaningful sense. That we'd crossed a line that couldn't be recrossed professionally. Victoria felt her chest tighten. Marcus, let me finish, he interrupted gently. I know this is complicated. I know you compromised your ethics. I know you're probably having a crisis of conscience right now because you're one of the most principled people I've ever met. But I want you to know something. When you were my therapist, you gave me something I didn't know I needed. You gave me permission to be terrified and still try. You gave me a space where my fear didn't have to turn into rage. That's what therapy is supposed to do, Victoria said carefully. Yes, it is, which is why I'm going to keep seeing Dr. Chen. I'm going to do the actual work of healing with him, but this, Marcus gestured between them, this isn't therapy. This is something else. And I'd like to know if you feel it too. Victoria's hands trembled as she reached for her water glass. If I say yes, I'm acknowledging that I violated professional ethics for personal desire. You are. If I say yes, I'm accepting that I might be rationalizing something that's ultimately harmful to you. That's a risk, Marcus agreed. But Victoria, I've spent my entire life letting fear make my decisions. I threw away a woman who loved me because I was terrified of being vulnerable. I almost threw away my company because I was terrified of showing integrity. And I almost let you walk away without even trying because I was afraid of what it would mean if you felt the same way I do. How do you feel? Victoria asked quietly. Like you're the first honest thing that's ever happened to me. Like you saw who I actually am, broken, angry, terrified, and didn't run. And like I'm standing on the edge of something that could destroy me or save me, and I'm choosing to jump anyway. Victoria set down her water glass with shaking hands. This is a terrible idea. Probably, Marcus agreed. My career could suffer if this becomes public. It could, he acknowledged, though I have excellent lawyers who are very good at preventing things from becoming public. That's not actually reassuring. I know. Marcus reached across the table, and Victoria let him take her hand. His touch was gentle, which somehow made it more overwhelming than if he'd been forceful. But I also know that I trust you, that I believe you're going to hold me accountable the same way you did in that conference room. And that if this turns out to be a disaster, at least it'll be an honest disaster. Victoria looked down at their interlaced hands. If we do this, if we actually try, there are things we need to establish. Like what? Like, I'm not your therapist anymore. Which means I can't play that role if this gets complicated. You'll need someone else for actual processing and emotional work. Door already arranged, Marcus said. Dr. Chen's first session is Friday. And you need to be honest with me about things. Real, vulnerable, uncomfortable honesty. No performance. No deflection into humor or anger. I can do that, Marcus said. Can you? Victoria met his eyes. That's what I'm terrified of. Why? Because vulnerability is harder than I think. Because I've spent my career teaching other people how to feel while I've been suppressing my own emotions. Because I'm 40 years old and I've never let anyone close enough to actually hurt me. Marcus squeezed her hand. Then we can be terrified together. The waiter arrived to take their order, and the moment fractured slightly, practical details requiring attention. But as they ordered and waited for food, the conversation evolved. Marcus talked about what he'd been feeling since the board meeting, how stepping down from CEO had been liberating in ways he didn't expect, how the fear of irrelevance that had driven him for so long seemed somehow smaller now. I think, he said, twirling pasta on his fork, that I've been confusing significance with success. Building things not because they mattered, but because if I built enough of them, I'd matter. Do you feel like you matter now? Victoria asked. Marginally more, Marcus said with a slight smile. Mostly because I'm terrifying a woman who's clearly way too smart for me. You're not terrifying me, Victoria said. You're confusing me. There's a difference. What's the difference? Terrifying implies I want to run away. I'm not running. Marcus set down his fork and leaned back in his chair, studying her with an intensity that made her pulse accelerate. You know what I noticed in our sessions? You always sit slightly angled toward the door. You always position yourself so you have an exit. You've constructed your entire life around exits. It's not a judgment, he interrupted gently. It's an observation. You taught me that hurt comes from connection. So you connected minimally, professionally. You gave people access to your clinical skills, but not to you. Victoria set down her fork as well. And you think you're going to change that? No, Marcus said. I think you're going to change it. Because you're braver than you think. Because you walked into my office knowing I was a disaster and decided to help me anyway. Because you took a risk on me when it would have been so much easier to transfer me to someone else immediately. That was irresponsible. Yes, Marcus agreed, but it was also brave. Irresponsibility and bravery are sometimes the same thing. They finished dinner, and Marcus paid despite Victoria's protests. They walked through Tribeca as the city transitioned from evening to night, the streets glittering with the peculiar magic of New York in December. He reached for her hand as they walked, and she let him hold it, which felt like the most significant thing she'd done in years. They ended up on the Brooklyn Bridge at 11 p.m., and standing against the railing and looking out at the illuminated skyline, the water below reflected the lights into something almost supernatural. I have a question, Victoria said, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Okay. In 5 years, do you see this still working? Do you see yourself with me? Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Honestly, always. I don't know, he said finally. I don't have a good track record with long-term connection. I don't know how to be in a relationship without turning it into a power dynamic or a possession. I don't know if I'm capable of the kind of sustained vulnerability that makes love work. Victoria's heart sank slightly. But, Marcus continued, I know that I want to try. I know that the idea of not trying is somehow worse than the risk of failing, and I know that if anyone could teach me how to do this, it's you. Not because you're a therapist, you're not my therapist anymore, but because you see who I actually am and you don't require me to be better than that. You just require me to be honest about it. Victoria turned to face him fully. I'm scared, she admitted. Of what? Of hurting you. Of being hurt by you. Of this becoming yet another thing I overanalyze until it stops working. Of my career imploding. Of my colleagues finding out and judging me. Of discovering that I've made a catastrophic mistake. Marcus reached up and tucked that strand of hair behind her ear again. The same gesture from his office. Those are all legitimate fears. And they might all happen, but you know what I've learned in these past few weeks? Fear is just the thing that happens right before growth. It's the signal that you're doing something that matters. That's very therapeutic of you, Victoria said with a small smile. I've had an excellent therapist, Marcus said, and then he kissed her. It was gentle and careful and absolutely devastating in its tenderness. Victoria's hands found his jacket, and she let herself experience the sensation of being held by someone who understood her, who'd watched her work and seen her vulnerabilities and chose to be patient with her anyway. When they broke apart, Victoria rested her forehead against his. This is going to be complicated. I'm counting on it, Marcus said. They stood on the Brooklyn Bridge for another hour, talking and holding each other and occasionally kissing in ways that felt less like passion and more like recognition, like two people who'd finally found the frequency on which they could communicate. When Victoria finally went home at 2 a.m, she did something she'd never done before. She called her supervisor. I need to report an ethical violation, she said when Dr. Patel answered, sounding confused from sleep. Victoria, what happened? I've become romantically involved with my client. Former client, technically, as I've transferred his care. but the involvement occurred while I was still his treating therapist. There was a long pause. Do you need to report this to the board? I don't know, do I? That depends, Dr. Patel said carefully. Did you have a therapeutic relationship that you've now violated? Yes. And is there a significant power differential? Yes. He's my client. I was in a position of authority and influence. Then yes, Dr. Patel said. You need to report it to the ethics board. And you need to have him sign a retroactive consent form acknowledging that he understands the power dynamics and is choosing to proceed anyway. Victoria's stomach dropped. That could affect my license. It could, Dr. Patel said gently, depending on how the board interprets the situation. But Victoria, I've known you for 20 years. I know you're not the kind of person who takes ethical violations lightly. Tell me honestly, did you pursue this client romantically? No, Victoria said. The opposite. I tried to maintain boundaries, but my boundaries failed. And now? Now I'm choosing to report my own violation and face whatever consequences come. Dr. Patel sighed. That's the most ethical thing you could do. Fill out the report, get consent documentation from your former client, and prepare for the possibility that the board might require a formal investigation. Victoria hung up the phone and sat in her dark apartment, feeling the weight of consequences settling over her like snow. She'd crossed a line, now she had to own it. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Thank you for taking a chance on me. Whatever happens, I don't regret this. Victoria typed back, I reported the ethical violation. We need to formalize consent documentation. This is going to get complicated. The response came immediately. I'm ready if you are. Victoria looked out at the Brooklyn skyline, glittering with the hopes and fears of 8 million people trying to connect. She thought about courage and stupidity and the impossible space between them. Then she typed, I'm ready. The ethics board investigation took 6 weeks, 6 weeks of depositions, of reviewing session notes, of Victoria's entire professional life being dissected by a panel of 3 senior psychologists who looked at her with expressions that ranged from disappointment to barely concealed judgment. 6 weeks during which Marcus had signed the retroactive consent documentation, stating that he understood the power dynamics of the therapeutic relationship and was choosing to pursue a romantic connection anyway. 6 weeks during which his lawyers had reviewed everything, prepared arguments, and made it clear that they could and would litigate if necessary. 6 weeks during which Victoria and Marcus existed in a strange liminal space. They weren't hiding, they weren't advertising, they were simply 2 people trying to build something while the world decided whether it was legitimate or exploitative. The investigation report came on a Tuesday, exactly 6 weeks after their dinner in Tribeca. Dr. Patel called her personally. They're not revoking your license, she said immediately, but they are recommending a 6-month probation period, mandatory ethics retraining, and a requirement that you only take clients with no romantic history for the next 2 years. Victoria felt something release in her chest that she hadn't realized she was holding. That could have been worse. It could have, Dr. Patel agreed. The board noted that you self-reported the violation, that you transferred the client's care immediately, and that you have 40 years of ethical practice without incident. They also noted that the client consented retrospectively and that there's no evidence of exploitation or harm. What changed their minds? Your former client's therapist, Dr. Patel said. Doctor? Chen submitted a statement saying that Marcus Sterling has made significant progress in emotional regulation and that he believes the relationship with you, while ethically complicated, has been therapeutically beneficial. He argued that forcing a separation might cause more harm than allowing the relationship to continue under supervision. Victoria closed her eyes. Marcus had done this. He'd gone to his new therapist and advocated for her, trusted that the truth would protect rather than condemn. There's one more thing, Dr. Patel continued. The board wants you to come speak to their ethics committee in 6 months. They want to understand your perspective on the situation, how you rationalized the boundary violation, how you're managing the conflict, what you've learned. Oh, of course they do, Victoria said. Victoria, for what it's worth, I think you're going to be okay. You made a mistake, you owned it, and now you're living with the consequences. That's actually the most ethical thing any of us can do. Victoria told Marcus the news over dinner at their apartment, a one-bedroom in Park Slope that they'd rented together 3 weeks ago. It was small and imperfect, and exactly what they both needed. "So you're staying in practice," Marcus said, and she could hear the relief underneath the simple statement. "I'm staying in practice, with restrictions, but I'm staying." Marcus pulled her into a hug that lasted longer than necessary. "I was terrified they'd revoke your license. I was prepared to hire lawyers, fight it all the way." "I know," Victoria said, pulling back to look at him. "Thank you for what you did, for talking to Dr. Chen, for advocating for me." "Of course I did. I wasn't about to let you lose your career because we fell in love." Victoria froze. "We fell in love." Marcus's expression shifted into something like panic. "I mean, I did. I definitely did." "Are you not?" "I am," Victoria said quickly. We haven't said it yet. Out loud." "Is there a protocol?" Marcus asked with a slight smile. "Should I have scheduled it with your calendar?" "I'm terrified," Victoria said instead of answering, "of saying it, of what it means, of the permanence of it." Marcus took her face in his hands, a gesture that had become familiar over the past 6 weeks. "Then don't say it yet, but know that I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." But the relief of the ethics board decision was short-lived. 2 days later, Marcus received a call from the corporate attorney handling the Riverside project reconstruction. The structural issues that had triggered the board crisis had now become a liability nightmare. One of the buildings had developed a critical flaw in its foundation. Nobody had been hurt yet, but the potential was catastrophic. "It's going to cost $30 million to fix," the attorney explained, "and you're going to be sued by every tenant and investor in that complex." Marcus sat in their apartment, phone pressed to his ear, and Victoria watched his entire body tense into something like his old self, the version of him that existed before therapy, before her, before he'd learned that vulnerability wasn't weakness. "Schedule a press conference," he said coldly. "I'm going to address this publicly, and get me the structural engineer's report. I want to know exactly what went wrong and why it wasn't caught." After he hung up, Victoria found him standing at their window, staring out at Brooklyn with an expression she recognized as fear masquerading as resolve. "Talk to me," she said. "I'm going to lose everything," Marcus said flatly. "Again. The lawsuits will bankrupt the company. My reputation will be destroyed. I'll be known as the developer whose building literally fell apart. Or," Victoria said carefully, "this is an opportunity to show that you've actually changed. That the man who threw a laptop at a wall 6 weeks ago is gone. That you've built something stronger in his place." "How?" Marcus demanded. "By what miracle does taking responsibility for $30 million in damages somehow create opportunity? By being transparent about what happened. By showing the investors and tenants that you're willing to absorb the cost because it's the right thing to do. By proving that integrity actually means something." Marcus turned to face her, and she saw something break in his expression. "I don't know if I'm strong enough for that. I don't know if I can handle losing my company." "You already know you can," Victoria said gently. "You stepped down as CEO. You watched your board restructure itself. You survived that and came out the other side still functioning, still trying, still here. This is different." "Is it?" Victoria asked. "Or is it just bigger, which means it feels more terrifying?" Marcus sat down heavily on their couch, and Victoria moved to sit beside him. She didn't offer solutions or therapeutic reframes. She just sat with him in the fear. "If I lose Sterling Development, what am I?" he asked quietly. "Without my company, without my power, without the thing I've built, what am I?" "You're the man I love," Victoria said. and felt the words settle into permanence the moment they left her mouth. "You're the man who's brave enough to face his father's ghosts and refuse to become them. You're the man who can sit in a room with me and be vulnerable. You're Marcus Sterling the person, not Marcus Sterling the developer. And that person has so much more value than any company ever could." Marcus looked at her like she'd just offered him a lifeline. "You love me." "I do," Victoria confirmed. "Which is both the best and worst thing that's happened to me professionally." "I know," Marcus said. "I'm sorry. Don't apologize, just stay. Stay here. Let's get through this together." The next 4 weeks were chaos. Marcus held a press conference where he publicly acknowledged the structural failure and announced that Sterling Development would be absorbing all reconstruction costs. The media response was immediate and brutal. There were headlines questioning his competence, his judgment, his entire career. There were think pieces about how his therapeutic journey had made him soft, unable to make the hard decisions necessary to run a company. There were also unexpected moments of grace. Investors who'd worked with Sterling Development for years came forward to defend him publicly. Architects and engineers wrote op-eds about how his insistence on integrity in this situation restored their faith in the industry. The woman he'd let go 3 years ago, the one whose wedding invitation he'd received, reached out personally to say she was impressed by his handling of the crisis. Victoria attended a dinner where one of Marcus's board members pulled her aside. "I don't know what you did to him," the man said, "but whatever it is, don't stop. He's becoming a better version of himself, and it's making all of us better too." But there was also professional danger. 3 weeks into the crisis, Victoria received a call from the New York Times. They were running a story about the ethical board investigation. They had confirmed sources. They wanted her side of the narrative. She declined to comment, but they published the story anyway. The headline read, "Therapist who violated ethics code assists billionaire's crisis management." The article detailed her investigation, Marcus's consent documentation, and raised questions about whether their relationship compromised her objectivity in advising him during the Riverside crisis. Victoria's phone rang constantly. Other therapists wanting to know if she was okay. Colleagues asking uncomfortable questions about her judgment. Journalists requesting interviews. A podcast about professional ethics violations, wanting to feature her as a cautionary tale. She withdrew her availability for new clients, cancelled her consultation group, and considered taking a leave of absence entirely. "Don't," Marcus said firmly when she suggested it. "Don't let them dictate your choices. You did nothing wrong by falling in love with me. You did everything right by reporting it and facing the consequences. My reputation is being destroyed." "Your reputation will recover," Marcus said. "What won't recover is your career if you abandon it now. That's what defeat looks like." "I'm not sure I have the strength for this," Victoria admitted. Marcus took her hands and held them firmly. "Then let me be strong for you until you find yours again. That's what being in a partnership means." Breathed. 3 months after the Riverside crisis began, Marcus met with the project's investors and presented a comprehensive reconstruction plan. The cost had risen to $42 million, but Sterling Development had secured the funding and timeline for completion. More importantly, they'd implemented new structural safety protocols that would become industry standard. The company survived. It would be smaller, restructured, less profitable in the short term, but fundamentally more ethical. The kind of company that could exist in the world without leaving damage in its wake. Victoria's professional reputation began a slow recovery. An influential article in the Journal of Clinical Ethics raised thoughtful questions about therapeutic relationships, consent, and the possibility of transformation when boundaries are violated with integrity. The author didn't mention her by name, but the implication was clear. Sometimes the most ethical response to a violation is honest reckoning rather than denial. She began seeing new clients again in April, 12 months after Marcus had first entered her office with clenched fists and a lifetime of armor. On their one-year anniversary of that first session, Victoria and Marcus stood on the Brooklyn Bridge again, the same spot where he'd kissed her for the first time. "I have something for you," Marcus said, reaching into his jacket pocket. Victoria's heart stopped. "Before you panic," he continued, "this isn't what you think, or maybe it is. I don't know, but I wanted you to have it." He pulled out a small velvet box and opened it to reveal a simple gold band. No diamond, no ostentatious display, just a clean, elegant circle of gold. "I'm not proposing," Marcus said. "Not yet, but I wanted you to have this as a promise. As proof that I'm not going anywhere, that I'm choosing you deliberately, consistently, and with full knowledge of what that means." Victoria took the box with trembling hands. "What does it mean?" "It means I'm the man who's going to show up for you when the world questions your judgment. It means I'm going to respect your boundaries while asking you to take risks with me. It means I'm going to keep working on myself, keep learning, keep being braver than I was yesterday. And if you can't," Victoria asked, "if you fall back into old patterns, then we'll face it together," Marcus said, "with honesty, with willingness to get help, with the understanding that love isn't about never making mistakes. It's about facing them when they happen and choosing each other anyway." Victoria slipped the ring onto her finger and felt something settle into permanence. Not the terrifying kind of permanence she'd feared, but the grounded kind. The kind built on integrity and choice and the mutual decision to be brave. "I love you," she said, because she could say it now without fear. "Even though you're complicated and wounded and occasionally infuriating." "I love you too," Marcus said. "Even though you analyze everything and sometimes use your therapist voice on me and occasionally make me feel like I'm being studied instead of loved." "That might never go away," Victoria warned. "I'm counting on it," Marcus said. And then he kissed her as the Manhattan skyline glittered around them, and Victoria finally understood what it meant to stop managing your own emotions long enough to actually feel them. 1 year later, Victoria sat in her office on the Upper West Side, a new space she'd rented after her practice had grown substantially following the Ethics Board investigation. The irony wasn't lost on her. Her reputation had been damaged by her relationship with Marcus, and yet that same relationship had made her a sought-after therapist. People wanted to work with someone who'd lived through ethical complexity and emerged with integrity intact. The morning sunlight filtered through the windows, casting geometric shadows across her desk. She had 17 minutes before her 9 a.m. appointment, a corporate executive struggling with vulnerability, which felt like cosmic humor of the highest order. Her phone buzzed, a text from Marcus. "Nervous about tonight?" Tonight was the gala, the Sterling Development Foundation's annual benefit, where Marcus would be publicly unveiled as the new director of their expanded charitable initiatives. It was his first major public appearance since the Riverside crisis, his first real step back into the public eye as a changed version of himself. Victoria typed back, "Should I be?" His response came immediately. "Only if you're worried about me having a public meltdown in front of 300 of New York's most influential people." "Are you going to have a meltdown?" she typed. "I'm going to have you sitting next to me. That makes everything manageable." Victoria smiled and set down her phone. That was the difference a year had made. Marcus wasn't cured. Therapy didn't work that way. He still had moments of volatility, still occasionally let frustration override his better judgment. But now he had tools. He had awareness. He had someone who loved him without requiring him to be perfect. More importantly, he had learned that imperfection wasn't failure. The gala began at 7 p.m. Again, Victoria found herself standing in front of her closet at 5:45, experiencing the particular anxiety of a woman who'd spent her entire life prioritizing professional presentation over personal style. She'd chosen a navy dress, elegant, understated, professional, the kind of dress that said she was Marcus's partner but not his accessory. The ring he'd given her caught the light as she fastened her earrings, and she twisted it absently, a nervous habit she'd developed over the past year. When Marcus arrived to pick her up, he was wearing a perfectly tailored tuxedo, and he looked like a man who was about to face something terrifying. "Hi," he said, entering her apartment. "Hi yourself," Victoria replied, watching him carefully. "How are you feeling?" "Like I'm about to present myself to the world as a reformed billionaire with a therapist girlfriend, and I'm not entirely sure they're going to accept either of those things." Victoria smiled and crossed the room to adjust his tie. "They don't have to accept anything. You're doing this for you, not for them." "I know," Marcus said, "but old habits die hard. Part of me still cares what they think." "That's human," Victoria said. "Just don't let it dictate your choices." He pulled her close, breathing her in like she was grounding him. "What would I do without you?" "Probably have another meltdown with expensive furniture," Victoria said. "But we're not going to find out, because I'm not going anywhere." "No." The gala was held at the Plaza Hotel, all crystal chandeliers and marble, and the kind of wealth that had stopped being subtle decades ago. Marcus and Victoria arrived at 8:15, deliberately late enough to avoid being the first, but early enough to establish his presence before the evening reached full momentum. The crowd parted slightly when he entered. Victoria felt it before she saw it, the moment when whispers shifted into acknowledgement, when the man who'd been a cautionary tale began to become something else. A reporter intercepted them almost immediately. "Mr. Sterling, your first public appearance since the Riverside restructuring. How are you feeling about your new role with the foundation?" Marcus's hand found Victoria's, and she felt him ground himself. "I'm grateful for the opportunity to redirect my energy towards something meaningful. For years, I was focused on accumulation. Now I'm interested in contribution. It's a fundamental shift in perspective." "And your personal life?" the reporter asked, glancing at Victoria. "Is it true you're in a relationship with your former therapist?" Victoria felt Marcus tense beside her. "Yes," he said clearly. "I am. Dr. Rivera provided me with professional support that fundamentally altered the trajectory of my life. And then, once that professional relationship concluded, we discovered we had something beyond that. It's been the best decision I've ever made." The reporter looked disappointed, clearly expecting scandal or defensive response. Instead, Marcus had simply stated fact. They moved through the gala, and Victoria watched him work the room with a different energy than she'd imagined. He wasn't performing. He wasn't trying to intimidate or impress. He was simply talking to people with genuine curiosity about their work, their families, their concerns. He was listening, actually listening, not just waiting for his turn to speak. At one point, she found herself standing with a group of Manhattan's most elite philanthropists, while Marcus was in conversation with a non-profit director. One of the women, a society figure Victoria recognized, leaned over and said quietly, "He's different. I knew him before. He was impressive, but he was terrifying. Now he's just human." "That's the goal," Victoria said. "How did you do it?" the woman asked. "I've heard the story about the ethics violation, the board investigation, all of it. How did you make him change?" Victoria considered the question carefully. "I didn't make him do anything. He made the choice to change. I just created a space where that choice felt possible." Later, during the silent auction, Marcus pulled Victoria aside to a quiet corner of the ballroom. They stood looking out at the Manhattan skyline through the tall windows, the same view they'd shared multiple times over the past year. "I did it," he said simply. "You did," Victoria agreed. "You gave a thoughtful response to a hostile question. You spent the evening genuinely connecting with people. You showed up as yourself instead of as a character." "I was terrified," Marcus admitted. "The whole time. I kept thinking about what would happen if I said the wrong thing, if someone called me out for the Riverside crisis. If the room decided I wasn't reformed enough. But you did it anyway. Because you were here," Marcus said. "Because I knew that whatever happened, I wouldn't be facing it alone." 3 months later, Victoria received an invitation to speak at the annual conference of the American Psychological Association. The topic was ethical complexity in therapeutic relationships, and the invitation specifically referenced her case, not by name, but the details were clear enough. She almost declined. The thought of being publicly dissected at a major professional conference made her nervous system spike, but Marcus had encouraged her. "You have something to teach," he'd said. "Not just about therapy, but about how to live ethically when circumstances force you into ethical grey areas. That matters." So she'd written the paper, and now she stood at the podium in front of 300 psychologists, preparing to speak about the most vulnerable period of her professional life. "I violated a fundamental boundary," she began. "I became emotionally invested in a client. I allowed that investment to compromise my professional judgment. By every traditional metric, I failed at my job." She could feel the tension in the room. Therapists were notorious for their discomfort with colleagues who'd crossed ethical lines. "But here's what I've learned," Victoria continued. "Ethical failure doesn't automatically mean moral failure. I violated professional protocols while simultaneously making my clients' well-being my priority. I reported my own violation. I faced consequences, and I maintained transparency throughout the process." She clicked to her next slide. A series of research studies about therapeutic outcomes when clients felt genuinely cared for by their providers. "We teach boundaries as though they're sacred," Victoria said, "and in many contexts they absolutely are. But we don't often acknowledge the complexity of human connection. We don't talk about the moments where the most ethical choice might be to admit we're human, to acknowledge our limitations, and to choose integrity over institutional protection." She paused, making eye contact with the audience. "My client, now my partner, is healthier than he was before our relationship. He's functioning better. He's experiencing genuine connection and growth. I'm not suggesting that all ethical violations lead to positive outcomes. Most of them don't. But I am suggesting that we need more nuanced conversations about what ethics actually means in a profession that's fundamentally about human connection." The response was mixed, some nodding thoughtfully, others clearly uncomfortable. But afterward, she received dozens of emails from therapists sharing their own ethical complexity. Situations where they'd crossed boundaries in small ways, felt guilty, but also recognized that their humanity had sometimes served their clients better than perfect protocol adherence would have. When she told Marcus about the response, he held her while she processed the strange liberation of being publicly honest about failure. "You were brave," he said simply. "I was terrified," Victoria corrected. "Bravery doesn't mean the absence of fear. It means moving forward anyway." She smiled against his shoulder. "Who taught you that?" "A very smart therapist," Marcus said. "She changed my life." 1 year after the gala, Victoria and Marcus were sitting in their apartment, which had evolved from the small one-bedroom in Park Slope to a beautiful two-bedroom in Brooklyn Heights with a view of the Manhattan skyline. They'd maintained the apartment in the city for work, but they'd made this space their home. Marcus was reviewing architectural plans for a new sterling development project, a non-profit housing complex in underprivileged neighborhoods designed to provide affordable homes without profit motive. Victoria was reading a draft of her upcoming book, Ethics and Eros, Navigating Intimacy in Professional Relationships. "This part about vulnerability," Marcus said, pointing to her laptop. "You're describing me in the third person, but anyone who knows us will recognize it as me. Is that okay?" Victoria asked. "Yes," Marcus said, "because it's honest, because it shows that reformed people aren't actually reformed. We're just people who've learned to manage our damage better." "That's actually a good quote," Victoria said, making a note. "Can I use it?" "Only if you credit me properly," Marcus said, "as your former client and current partner." Victoria closed her laptop. "Do you ever regret it? The relationship, the public scrutiny, the fact that your personal transformation became a case study. Marcus considered the question carefully. Every time I'm tempted to be angry at someone, and I remember my breathing exercises. Every time I want to withdraw, and I force myself to stay vulnerable. Every time I'm annoyed with you for analyzing my behavior. So, yes? No, Marcus said. I regret it constantly, but I wouldn't change it, because the alternative is being the man I was before, successful and powerful and fundamentally alone. This is harder. This is more complicated, but this is actually living instead of just accumulating. 6 months later, Marcus did propose, not on a bridge this time, but in their kitchen on a Tuesday morning, completely mundane and absolutely perfect. Victoria was drinking coffee while reading the New York Times when Marcus sat down across from her with a small box. I know I already gave you a promise ring, he said, but I want to make it official. I want to marry you. I want to build a life with you where we're both just trying to be better versions of ourselves and occasionally failing and then trying again. I want the messy, complicated, real version of love. Will you marry me? Victoria said yes while crying into her coffee. The wedding was small, 30 people, mostly therapists and members of the Sterling development team. They got married in Central Park on a day in October when the city was covered in gold leaves and the sky was impossibly blue. In her vows, Victoria talked about the man who'd walked into her office with clenched fists and left as someone capable of genuine connection. She talked about learning to be vulnerable herself, about how his growth had given her permission to grow. She talked about the way love works best when both people are committed to becoming better. In his vows, Marcus talked about the woman who'd refused to let him hide behind his anger. He talked about how her willingness to risk her career for honesty had taught him what integrity actually meant. He talked about choosing her every day, choosing connection, choosing growth. I know I'll mess this up sometimes, he said, his voice steady but emotional. I know I'm still going to have moments where I want to retreat into my old patterns. But I'm choosing you. I'm choosing us. I'm choosing the terrifying, vulnerable, absolutely worth it version of love. 3 years after that first session in Conference Room 3, Victoria received an invitation to present a case study at a major psychiatric conference. The case study was about the transformation of a man with untreated anger issues into someone capable of genuine emotional connection. They wanted her to talk about the miracle of therapy, the power of professional intervention, the triumph of science over human dysfunction. Victoria requested that Marcus present with her. Together, they stood on that stage and told the truth, that therapy wasn't magic, that healing was messy and complicated and sometimes involved ethical violations and professional consequences. That love couldn't fix everything, but it could create the conditions where healing became possible. They talked about his initial resistance, her professional failures, the way their relationship had forced them both to become more honest than they'd ever been before. They talked about the Riverside crisis and the reconstruction. They talked about the publicity and the judgment and the slow, grinding work of building something real on the foundation of mutual vulnerability. People want transformation to look like magic, Victoria said. They want the hero to have an epiphany and suddenly become perfect. Real transformation looks like a man learning to breathe through his rage. Real transformation looks like a woman risking her career for honesty. Real transformation looks like 2 people choosing each other on a Tuesday morning and doing it again every day after that. In the audience, Victoria could see people taking notes. Some were leaning forward, clearly engaged. Others looked uncomfortable, as though the rawness of the narrative violated some professional code they'd been taught. But several people, therapists who recognized their own complexity in the story, were crying. On their 5th anniversary, Victoria and Marcus stood on the Brooklyn Bridge again, as had become tradition. This time they weren't starting anything. They were simply acknowledging what they'd built. Do you remember when you said you didn't know if you could sustain connection? Victoria asked. I remember, Marcus said. I remember thinking I was fundamentally broken in ways that couldn't be fixed. And now? Now I know I was never broken, Marcus said. I was just afraid. And being afraid isn't the same as being damaged. It's just being human. Victoria leaned against him, looking out at the glittering skyline. Below them, the East River reflected lights like promises made and kept. I love you, she said. I know, Marcus replied. You analyze me constantly. You occasionally use your therapist's voice when you shouldn't. And you occasionally make me feel like I'm being studied instead of loved. And I still choose you every single day. That's the most romantic thing you've ever said to me, Victoria said. That's because you've taught me that romance isn't about grand gestures, Marcus said. It's about showing up. It's about consistency. It's about choosing each other when it would be easier not to. And they stood there for another hour. Two people who'd violated professional ethics and faced consequences and discovered that sometimes the cost of honesty is worth the price. Two people who'd learned that vulnerability isn't weakness, connection isn't codependency, and that the most powerful force in the world isn't money or rage or power. It's the courage to let someone in. It's the choice to keep showing up. It's the willingness to be truly, completely, authentically known. As the sun set over Manhattan, casting the city in shades of purple and gold, Victoria and Marcus kissed on the Brooklyn Bridge. Not the passionate kiss of beginnings, but the comfortable, grounded kiss of a couple that had survived scrutiny and doubt and chosen each other anyway. Behind them, the city glittered with millions of other stories, other people trying to connect, trying to matter, trying to build something real. But for this moment, on this bridge, there was only the two of them, and the absolute certainty that they'd made the right choice. Not the easy choice, not the professional choice, but the human choice. The choice to love someone despite the complications, because of the complications, and with full knowledge of what that love would cost and what it would give back. What did you think of the story? Share your opinion in the comments. Rate this story from 0 to 10. What was your score? Subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell to follow all our stories and have fun.